And is handed out, and she will take them. So if you could just fill those out, because feedback is important. It's how we make things better and keep the good things going. So not only do I work for Strong Center for Developmental Disability, but I'm also a parent of a 15-year-old that has Down syndrome. So 15 transitions. If you guys are in that like transition zone with me, it's a little bit of a frightening place to be. And so luckily we have some fantastic people to guide us. So let me introduce these fantastic people. This is Caitlin Richardson. She also works for the Strong Center for Developmental Disability. This is Liz Campbell. She works for OPWDD, or most of us know, Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. And this is Sue Ormandy, and she works for OPWDD as well. And then we have Jean Sigliano, and she is with Heritage Christian Services. So each of our panelists are going to talk for a few minutes about what they do, focused around transition. And then when everybody is all done, we'll open it up for questions. Take it away.
Hi, how is everybody? Great. I'm Jean Resigliano. I actually work for the Center for Human Services Education, a division of Heritage Christian Services. My role is that of RVR Community Employment Specialist, and I work in 107 schools providing professional development to all school staff around resources in the community. But my entire career has been focused on transition planning from entitlement to eligibility. If you read my bio, I am a parent of a child on the spectrum, and also a parent of a teacher in the Rochester City School District. I don't want to forget about her. So I'm going to go through a 2-hour presentation in 15 minutes. So I do want to say I will stay as long as you need me to if you have any questions about the resources that I've given you today. So I'll just be here. Okay? All right. So when the school bus doesn't stop, which is scary, because I've been through that process. But transition planning is a journey. As you heard the keynote today, it's a process. So it's not, it just begins with a one step. And so I like to say, my little catch ditty is we've got to start early and talk about it more often. I don't want transition to be confusing, so that's why I'm here today, and I will stay here as long as you need me to, or I'm going to give you my card and you can call me and ask me anything you want about transition. But it can be confusing. Well, we're going to try to clear as much as we can in 15 minutes. So look at it as every exit as being an entrance somewhere else. I believe my take on transition is that it's hope. So there's that light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes we have to create the tunnel and also create the light, but that's what the planning process is all about. Sorry. So the doors we open and close each day decide the lives we lead. I think as a parent of a child with a disability, I compared how many times the door opened for Lisa and how many times the door opened for Jenna, who does not have a disability. But and how often did she have chances to interact and react and have experiences and opportunities? And Lisa's opportunities, we tried to increase them as much as possible, but as you know, sometimes it's difficult to create those opportunities. But there's evidence to say the more experiences and opportunities your young adult or child has, the better that transition planning process and that outcome is going to be. So, let's see. Oops, did I go? Okay, so when we talk about transition, if your child has an IEP, we're looking at these 4 areas of living, learning, and earning, and actually the last, relationships, is something that I've added because it's all about relationships. So those are the areas that must be discussed in the IEP. I have given you a transition timeline. That actually came directly from the New York State Education Department website. I just adapted it because they still were calling Access VR VESID, and it didn't feel right to me. So that's exactly the timeline. Do all those activities have to happen at the same time, or do all those activities have to happen? No, it just depends. It's one person at a time. It's your child as we move forward. One of the things that's happened in New York State, and I know Caitlin is going to talk about this a little bit, is the Employment First Initiative. So in 2014, Governor Cuomo had signed an executive order to establish the Employment First Commission. So you may wonder, gee, why did those sheltered workshops close? Why are we looking at more integrated settings for individuals with disabilities? Because that's what we should be doing. So we're doing the right thing, but we should look, transition is looking at employment first. So if your son or daughter is exiting from high school, we're going to talk about employment, because in the end, we're all preparing for employment in one way or another. How that looks is going to be one person at a time. So that conversation is going to happen. So what's most important is, what are employers looking for? So I have the opportunity to sit on a committee called the Finger Lakes Advanced Manufacturing Enterprise. And I sit with companies who are manufacturers, who are global companies, so they serve a global customer base. And they say to me, Jean, if you can get them there on time, if they can work together as a team, I said, we'll work it from there. We'll teach them how to actually do the job. We may even pay, if they're good employees, for them to continue their education. But these are the skills, I don't care what you call it, CDOS skills, SCAN skills, soft skills, work skills, 21st century skills. These are the skills that employers are looking for that your son and daughter can do. Does that happen? Again, remember, transition planning is a process. But the more experiences and opportunities, and that includes volunteer opportunities, those are great opportunities that you're starting to build those skills. I don't think I have the employability profile that I made copies of, but if your son or daughter is achieving a career development occupational studies credential, then those are the life skills, and our keynote talked about some of those skills that are really important to talk about and work on at home, but we can talk more about that if you see me afterward. Let's see. Oh, there it is. So I'm going to pass by the level. So at age 12, if your child has an IEP, they should be experiencing a level 1 career assessment at age 12, and that needs to be reviewed yearly. The needs, interests, and preferences of the child is documented, the voice of the student, the parent, and a staff member that knows them. So we've got to create good ingredients, and opportunities are one of those ingredients. I told you it's a 2-hour training in 10 minutes. This is my quote that I kind of used from Eleanor Roosevelt, but I just made it for parents. So we're like tea bags. We don't know our own strength until we get into hot water, but we want to prevent you from getting into hot water. So the school role is really kind of giving that person the fish and helping them learn how to fish, and that's part of transition planning. How do we do it? You can't whistle a symphony, so we have to do it collaboratively, work together as a team. I just want to just promote, I created a presentation called The Eyes Habit. If your child has an IEP, an ISP, which will be moving to a life plan, or an IPE, which is the document from Access VR, they're probably similar, and there's always goals on all of these documents. I'll bet they're similar, and let's work together. Don't just keep them separate in silos. Let's talk to everybody and how can we work together. Well, there's evidence to say why we collaborate, but as part of the being compliant, writing in a compliant IEP, New York State Ed says we must be compliant. I'm going to really speak through. I am just touching on how many pathways there are to graduation. There are trainings across our region that talk more specifically, but I want you to know about them. There's not just one way to graduate. So relevant, we talked about this morning, but relevance drives the rigor. find your child's strengths, abilities, and let's work from there. Let's build on that. Let's not just write these goals or opportunities or activities that don't make sense for your kid. There's a blueprint, the blueprint for improved results for students with disabilities. Those are the 7 key principles that everyone is working on in New York State, and they're great principles. And one of the best ones is number 7, and that's to provide work-based learning for schools, students in school. Yep, and it's, again, a collaboration between everybody. And honestly, in our keynote again, it's like my students used to say, Ms. R, I made a mistake, but it gave me an opportunity to learn how to not do this again, but how to do it. WIOA, Workforce Investment Opportunity Act, I just wanted to touch on it because it's changing the way we do transition, actually in the U.S., so it's a federal law, and there's going to be some really nice money to support providing transition services earlier. And again, if you want to talk to me more about that, I'll stay after. And so these are the opportunities throughout our region, other services and supports. I just want to say quickly that Access VR, I work specifically with Access VR, so I've given you their transition brochure and their information handout, but if you'd like to talk more specifically, there is a vocational rehab counselor in every single high school, and a CES, that's me, in every single high school as well, so please talk to me afterward. I'm going to hand it over.
Okay, before I start talking to you all, I just want to know who in the room already has OPWDD eligibility for your child. Okay, so more than half. So you already know what you went through. I'm going to talk to the rest about eligibility requirements for services for kids with disabilities and how it's defined. Even before that, we do also, Liz and I have some handouts here. When you talk in any system, you talk word soup. So to help you guys with that, we have a handout with the acronym that should help you with current letters and what they mean. And if I say too many letters, I mean, I'm too far away from you guys to throw something to hit me, but I'm going to try to use words to make things easier. Under the New York State Mental Hygiene Law, the legal base for eligibility determination and it defines developmental disability as a disability person that is attributable to an intellectual disability, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, neurological impairment, autism, or Prader-Willi. Prader-Willi was just recently added as a legally defined disability under New York State Mental Hygiene Law. Any other attributable condition of person, because such condition results in similar impairment of general intellectual functioning or adaptive behavior to that of an intellectually disabled person, or requires treatment and services similar to those required for such person, and then it originates prior to age 22. It's expected to be ongoing, lifelong, and it can constitute a substantial handicap to such person's ability to function normally in society. So eligibility under mental hygiene law has to hit those 4 criteria. The 4 criteria being a diagnosable condition, the ones I named, prior to age 22, expected to be ongoing and indefinite, and create a substantial handicap. There are 2 ages to consider in eligibility as well. You can have, under age 8, you have provisional eligibility. The criteria for that eligibility is different than the permanent eligibility after age 8. The eligibility requirements for under age 8 can have to do with speech or motor impairments that impair someone's ability to function in society. Then after age 8 is more adherent to the things I had. And in the handout, there is a very simple form that they finally had come out with for parents that are makes it very easy to assist them in getting there as far as handing in paperwork that's needed. I'm sorry. And then the more higher level kind of blah, blah, blah stuff. But I'm going to go there because it's really important that when you are looking for eligibility that you know what you need and you can get it right the first time, because it's a process and it can be frustrating and we don't want that. Just like Jean said, we want to make it as least difficult as possible. So things I want to bring to your attention is that in order to help get eligibility, you need a psychological report. Anyone with intellectual disability under the score of 60 is pretty much in. You still have to have a report that defines the adaptive deficits. Okay, and then that, and you can look for eligibility for someone that's 80 as long as the documentation is there under, the disability occurred under age 22. So just because the person is over 22 doesn't mean they cannot apply for eligibility for OPWB supported services. In this document also defines what actual testing is usable for eligibility requirements, and those aren't always provided by the school. If you request it specifically, it's possible. Adaptive behavior measures should reflect a person's actual typical behavior, not on their best day. Any of these evaluations, you're going to get what you really need for eligibility. You have to talk about when you're not there, when they're independent and trying to do whatever task it is independently. I don't want to miss anything. But I wanted to just pay attention to the handouts, which would be helpful to you. And if you already have eligibility, awesome. You're starting to know what the services are. If you don't already receive them, Liz is going to talk about a relatively new way to access services. But this information also, take it with you. If you know someone that is struggling with their children at home and needs support, that's what we're here for. Survival support, to enhance natural support, to make your life with your child happy, not a struggle, less of a struggle. Doesn't mean it's not going to be a struggle. You don't have to wait until the person transitions to get these supports and services. A child can be evaluated from age birth on up. You don't have to transition. I want to make sure that that message is out there. So, I'll hand it back to Liz.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz. I also work at OPWDD with Sue. We're both self-direction liaisons, so I'm going to give a very brief 5 to 7 minute overview of self-direction. FYI, one of the handouts up there is our calendar of Self-Direction 101 family sessions that we do out in the community. We do about 2 per month at different agencies. Has anyone been to one of those sessions? I see it. Wow, okay. A good chunk of you have been. So you have probably heard this information, but for people that haven't been to one of the 101s, we'll do a condensed version. If you wanted to find out more information, I'd recommend going to one of the sessions or catching one of us afterwards. Another handout up there is our self-direction brochure. It has our, no, it does not have our contact information on it, but it gives a very condensed version of self-direction. So catch us after if you have other questions. So Sue mentioned that self-direction is a fairly new way to access services. So self-direction is not a program, it's not a service in and of itself. It's a way to have more flexibility and control over what types of services you have, who provides them for you or your child, when you receive them, etc. And it really is based on the idea that money follows the person. So if you need more support in one area, say respite, community hab, you can build more support in that area and not be restricted by some of the traditional restrictions with where how much service is allotted. So self-direction actually originated as something called Consolidated Supports and Services, CSS, if anyone had heard of that. I think that began around 10 years ago. Around 3 years ago, it was changed into self-direction. Same concept, but hopefully a lot simpler. We received more guidance, so it's more streamlined now, definitely, than it was back then. And I'm relatively new to this. I started in October, so I can't speak to the CSS days, but self-direction. So the core components of self-direction are, again, the flexibility and control. So someone who has OPWDD eligibility can seek to be authorized for self-direction. It's just very basic requirements to be authorized: active Medicaid, permanent eligibility, a few other things. But once you're authorized for self-direction, you hire a broker. So a broker is the person who actually helps put your budget together. And every individual who is authorized for self-direction, they have a particular budget dollar amount called their personal resource allowance, or PRA. So that PRA depends on a few things. It depends primarily on their adaptive health and behavioral needs. It also depends on the person's age. So if you are a child pre-graduation, before you finish school, before you age out, you receive 40% of your PRA. Once you've passed transition, you receive that full 100% of the PRA. When you are still in school, a child, obviously the Department of Ed is responsible for a lot of services, so you don't have the full OPWDD amount of money to spend. But once you do pass, you get the full amount. So the person works together with their broker that they hire. Another key component of the circle of support is a fiscal intermediary. They're actually an agency that acts as like the HR, billing, payroll component of the person's team. So a unique part of self-direction is the ability to self-hire staff. So you're able to self-hire community hab, respite, or supportive employment staff. So with self-hiring, you can choose someone that works well with your child. There are some restrictions with hiring family members, but let's say there's a teacher's aide who works really well with your child, and you want them to be ComHab self-hired staff. You can choose to pay that self-hired staff more money than they would typically receive if they worked at an agency. So you can pay them more money and build in more hours for that service, depending on the needs of your child. 2 minutes left, okay. So that's one of the big highlights of self-direction. In addition to that, there are a few goodies that are only available with a self-directed budget. So those goodies are in categories in a budget called IDGS, Individualized Goods and Services, OTPS, Other Than Personal Services, and then there's a category called Family Reimbursed Respite, FRR. The FRR is a $3,000 pot of money that you can use to reimburse someone to provide respite for your child. And that respite provider can be anyone. They don't have to be a staff, they don't have to be anyone who's authorized. It really can be whoever you choose to provide that respite. And you can use that in addition to if you get family reimbursement through family support services. That's all in your budget. The IDGS category pays for things like community classes, health club memberships, camps, so things that are a little bit more outside of the box that Medicaid wouldn't traditionally pay for. The OTPS category can pay for things like personal use transportation, staff activity fees, utilities, and then also wanted to plug that if someone's interested in living in a non-certified or independent setting, there are a lot of perks that self-direction can help support. So they can receive a housing subsidy, those utilities that I mentioned can be paid for through OTPS, so there are a lot of supports available if someone's interested in non-certified living. So that is a very, very basic overview, but pretty much you have a budget, you have the ability to amend it, it's very flexible, and you have a circle of support around you to help you and your child develop the budget and support you along the way. So contact us if you have questions about self-direction or come to one of our sessions.
Okay, and I'm Kate Richardson. I'm at the Strong Center for Developmental Disabilities, and I focus specifically on employment. So I'm going to wrap us up with a transition and employment focused conversation in 7 minutes. So as everyone else, I'm available afterwards if you have additional questions, because there's a lot to learn. Is everybody here, do you have school-age kids? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to be talking about really the adult service system world, and OPWDD, Access VR, they're state agencies that help fund those supports and services after school. Some of them, as I mentioned, can start in school, but I'm really going to be focusing on adult services and supports that you can have access to after school. So as Jean mentioned, New York State is an employment first state, so what that means is when we're looking at services and supports for people, we're thinking and talking about employment first. So there are other supports and services that aren't employment in the community, like day habilitation and sheltered workshops are being phased out, but those are not employment in the community type services and supports. So what this initiative really did was forced our service system to talk about employment, because we know there are a lot of benefits that come with employment outside of a paycheck, because that's really exciting. And you know, when we're working with 18 to 21-year-olds, that's kind of the highlight of employment, but there are a lot of other benefits that come with working in the community. You know, it facilitates social inclusion. Both mental and physical health benefits have been, research proven. So there are a lot of benefits to employment, and I think that's why we're not the only state that's doing this. There are a lot of states that have employment first policies, so we don't have that. Cuomo just issued this recommendations on kind of how to get us there. But these are the reasons why we're talking about employment in a new and different way. And I put this slide up here not to scare you, but I think it's an important conversation, and that's why, as Jean said, we want to start talking about it early, because there are discrepancies. And these are New York State specific statistics. On the left there, that's for, I think, 16 to 21-year-old. The blue bar is the employment rate for people with no disabilities, and then the red and green are either cognitive disabilities or all disabilities. And you can see there's like a 20% gap for the 16 to 21-year-olds, but when you move over there on the right, that gap doubles. So that's why and research says that when you have transition and work-based learning type opportunities in high school, the likelihood of you working after school is a lot higher. So that's why we're focusing, Jean talked about some legislation that adds more dollars to support people with disabilities with work opportunities in high school, because we know that the outcomes are better when you're doing it early and you're talking about it often. So those statistics really haven't changed much in the past 30 years. It's 2013 there, it's the same right now. So the work that we're doing, we're seeing better outcomes when we're talking about it early and often. So that's what we're here today to encourage you to do. So there is a continuum of employment supports offered by these state agencies. So sheltered workshops on the left being the most segregated option. There are enclaves, so that's group employment, so it could be up to 8 people working together. And then competitive employment, that's independently working, maybe with a job coach or supported staff. But it's a job that anyone can apply for and get, and you're paid minimum wage. Your expectations aren't any different than any other worker, so that's kind of what we're striving for. That's the gold standard. And we can see that an independent life is possible, working at 20 hours a week. If you're working 2 hours a week, that's not going to fund a life. So when you're talking about kind of the end goal, we really encourage thinking about 20 hours a week at the prevailing wage. It is still legally permissible if you have a 14C certification to pay someone with a disability below minimum wage. So that's something that I didn't know before I started this job, but it's still legal to pay someone with a disability below minimum wage. But there are supports and services that are available to make competitive employment possible. So these are some of the challenges and barriers that impact employment the full potential. And transportation is huge, and so I always like to bring that up. When you're thinking about employment and you're thinking about possibilities, having a plan for transportation is really important to consider. Accommodations on the work site in school, a lot of work is done to figure out what your child needs to be successful in school, and that translates really well into employment settings. So thinking about the supports and services that make kind of school work smoothly translate really well into employment. And Jean mentioned the IEP. Access VR has an IPE and OPWDD has the ISP, and they should all kind of look similar. And schools do a lot of work and spend a lot of money to figure out what works well, and that can translate well into the adult service system. Some autism-specific barriers to employment, thinking about interviewing. So what can you do at home to help prep for interviews, managing change, the jobs that we have at the university, there's a lot of, the day doesn't always look the same. So what can you do at home to kind of prep and teach flexibility, anxiety about stress and work. So I think a lot of things can be done during school to think about some barriers that might occur down the road. And there are a lot of strategies that help ensure success, and the job coaching position that's funded by Access VR and OPWDD, they should be able to work with you and kind of build on what the schools have talked about that are accommodations that work, but they do all of these types of supports to help people be successful on the job. Self-advocacy is really important. The better your son or daughter is able to advocate for themselves, the better off they're going to be on an employment setting. So the more that they can say, this works for me, this is how I can do the job the best, employers might not know that if they're not able to advocate and say it for themselves. So I think any way that you can help foster self-advocacy skills early and often is really important. And that's, being aware of your strengths and being able to talk about them. Being able to talk about your disability is really important. I'm going to, in 2 seconds, talk about Project Search, which is a transition to work program that's available in the community. And we had a kid who was deaf in 1 ear, and he didn't want to tell his boss. And his boss gave feedback on one of the evaluations that he was rude and not, I tell him things and he doesn't do them, but it was because he couldn't hear. And he hadn't talked about his disability with his supervisor, and it took that experience for him to say, okay, I need to speak up about, just walk over to my left side and talk to me on this side, and I will do whatever you ask me to do. But I think those kinds of experiences are really important. I'm going to skip over all these things. So there's this website called mypathnewyork.org, and I think you got bags, and there's a flyer for this in your bag. And it's a website that navigates eligibility for the different services and state agencies that are in our community. So it navigates the eligibility process for you. OPWDD and Access VR are 2 separate agencies, but they can work well together. And so there's some information about how those different supports and services can work together to maximize impact. When we work in silos, things don't go well. So the more that you can blend different supports that you're getting, the better off you're going to be. There is session 2 is called Preparing for Work. So it's starting to think about, do you have a resume? Even if you don't have work experience, you've done volunteering, you've done different things that you can add to your resume. Your mom's not a professional reference, you want to list when you're listing professional references. So it does all of those sorts of things and kind of navigates you through the transition to employment process. Project Search is a program in our community. There are a number of different programs. I just happen to be involved in Project Search, but I encourage you to ask your school districts and agencies that you're connected with about transition type programming, because when I started this conversation, the more experience and work-based learning type experience that your kids have in school, the better off they're going to be long term. I think there's a lot of emphasis on passing Regents tests and all of those kinds of things, but it's really important to get some work experience before you leave school. So this is a program that does just that. There's different internships in different businesses with job coaching supports. You can access it both in school and after school if you're OPWDD eligible. There is an adult program in our community, and I believe that there's a Project Search brochure in your bag as well, so it has all of the different information about the programs that we have. So Wegmans is a program that's supported by BOCES 1 and Lifetime Assistance, and it gets funding from Access VR and OPWDD, and it's a high school transition program. So if you're a BOCES 1 district, you would have access to the Wegmans program. It typically happens in your last year of school eligibility, so if you're going to school through 21, it would be like your last year of school eligibility, but it's just different for everybody, so we don't have like a hard fast, this is for 16-year-olds, so it's just your last year of high school eligibility. At the medical center, we have a similar program, but it's with BOCES 2, supported by Arkham Monroe. The city of Rochester has one, and those internships are in city government. And then the adult program that I mentioned is at the Del Monte Hotel Group. So it's internships in those different businesses, so you could do, and it's 3 different internships, so you could do an internship in cashiering, you could do one, stocking produce, and you could do one in the bakery. So it's career exploration, you're trying different jobs, and then it's the goal of a competitive job at the end of it. And it's a year-long, really intensive, and the supports are really high, so it's a really successful transition program, and it's a national program. There are about 500 programs. It's international across the world, but New York has 20 of them, and we're very fortunate to have 4 in our community. So I know we've given you an overwhelming amount of information, but the more information you have, the better off you're going to be. And ask questions, call us. I talked about self-advocacy for your son or daughter, but I've seen parents be tremendous advocates for their kids through this process as well. So thank you so much for being here. Like I said, taking your Saturday morning, we really appreciate it.
We have 7 minutes for questions. We told you I'm the queen of time. So,
I have a question related to my 41-year-old son who gave up his OPWDD status, and we're trying to get him back in. And because of his age, he did not have the tests that are available now for his autism. So they're requiring us to go back to have him retested. And I wondered if you had any suggestions or input. And I also want to say to other parents, don't let your kids give up their services, because he tried on his own for several years, but really needed the support for his employment.
I'm glad you brought that up, because actually, OPWDD is a lifelong service. So even if with a kid with autism that's denied and you go through the fair hearing process and they're still not eligible, you can go back. You don't have to take it and bring, updated evaluations. As far as your son, if they're requesting, there is a clinic, I think in Penn Yan, through an ARC, that you can get adult testing done. And if he has a previous or somewhere, he had eligibility at one point?
Yes, he did for many years.
Okay, so they're asking for retesting. You can ask for that documentation to bring with you to the clinic. It should be no cost to you, or through Medicaid, because those tests are very expensive. But I believe there's a clinic in Penn Yan. If I need your name, I can get that to you. I can email it or get that information to you. Because there's one clinic here that they'll do adults. Because I know the local clinics do to age 16 or something. It's frustrating.
Thank you.
Or else you pay a lot of money. If you have $2,500 in pocket, just do it. Sure. I think that one clinic with that previous documentation should do it with the Medicaid.
I just wanted to point out that one of the other viable options when you do an assessment is to consider children that are aging out or transitioning into adulthood file for SSI. And that's what I do, is help people with SSI disability hearings. And particularly I set up a niche for people with pervasive developmental delay or on the spectrum. Don't give up hope if your child is working, because if they're in a supportive environment and not substantial, they could still conceivably work and get SSI. So you will always lose at the initial level, but you need to present a compelling argument at the hearing.
Can I just add, if your child is going through Access VR eligibility, which most students with IEPs and probably 504s should be referred. If your child is 2 years prior to exit and they haven't been referred to Access VR, you're going to go to your teacher or someone in the school and say, I want my child to be referred to Access VR, because that's, so if they are, there's financial literacy information, eligibility criteria, like an individual can work and still receive their benefits, but it's benefits counseling is one of the services that Access VR can provide. And I didn't get a chance to talk about Access VR too much, but I also want you to understand that if your child has an IEP or 504, again, there's an Access VR in every single secondary school, so please ask that question.
And mypathNewYork.org, that website I was mentioning, I talked about the first couple sessions. There's 4 sessions of content, and the 4th one is a financial literacy session, and it has a benefits calculator in it, so you can see when you start to work, your SSI check is going to go down, but it does the math to show you how much you're going to end up with. So, if you're not working at all, you might get a $700 check, but you go back to work and let's say you're bringing in $500 a month, your check's going to go down, but you're going to have the $500 from your employer, so together that might be $1,000. So it's doing the math to show you that you're going to walk away with $300 more than if you hadn't been working. So we know fear of loss of benefits is a barrier to employment, and so this website does some of that math, and then it refers to the financial literacy people that it can actually do your specific situation in more detail, but the website does that for that purpose, because we know it's a barrier.
And so many times, you apply for SSI and they deny you the first time. If people give up, and you should never not appeal, you should always appeal the first decision.
But what if nothing's changed? It's all the same.
You ask for additional documentation from school, you ask for the
But they're
Access
not in
VR.
school. They're not in school. They
You
don't
ask for
know.
the Access VR evaluation, you ask for the OPWD evaluation, you find, go to an advocate that can sit with you and go through the appeal process with you. Don't do it alone. There's always more.
There are some resources in the community that are free resources if you've been denied, so we can talk if you want to give me your email, I can send them to you.
Starbridge is an agency in our community that has some parent advocates that can work. Is that true? I'm looking at Carrie because Carrie worked for Starbridge
They
before.
do appeals though. They don't do appeals, and they have a benefits person that can probably help you, but it sounds like we have someone in the room that can help as well, or did I not understand that? So we're glad you came today. Thank
I can leave some cards up front if anybody.
Okay, perfect.
The Regional Center for Independent Living, we all have one in every area of our state, and they don't even require documentation of disability. You can walk in, or your son or daughter can walk in and say, I have a disability and I need help, and there's really an array of services that they can provide and assistance.
What's that called?
Regional Center for Independent Living, it's on State Street.
So we technically have no more time, but I see one more hand.
No,
So why not?
Caitlin, this question's for you. So I see, Caitlin and I worked together for a while, and I see Project Search and your environments and the Del Monte and things like that. So there's a shortage of what we refer to as blue-collar jobs in America. In about 10 to 15 years, that shortage is just going to be exponential and increase even more. So are you working around union shops and potentially having some internships in places like that, apprenticeships, we're talking plumbers, carpenter, things like that, that really there's going to be a significant gap in our country. And I see this as an ability to fill that gap.
So I would say, so the BOCES have career CTE programming, so career and technical education, and the city has Edison. And we're doing a program evaluation with Wayne Finger Lakes BOCES right now to figure out, those programs have not historically served students with disabilities very well. So we're doing an evaluation to kind of figure out what is the problem. And then make some recommendations. So the report is going to be happening this summer. But you're completely spot on that is an area where they have a shortage, and supply and demand. We got to figure out how to make it work, because there are a whole lot of supports in the school system that can help students with disabilities be successful in those types of programs. program, so why isn't it happening? So I don't have a good answer, but
No, as long
we're
as
trying.
you know, like, that's what I want the
Yeah.
conversation.
And I just want to say that school districts are talking about the middle skills and are we really preparing? Because we have conversations with employers, so educators are sitting with employers and saying, I have these jobs immediately for students, but you're not preparing them. But there are lots of resources and there are lots of credentials and just certificate programs. Some of these certificate programs are a day to maybe 18 months. Again, going back to Access VR, those are some things that they could possibly, if you meet financial criteria, that they are funded. But that's always, I'm just saying may, because the VR vocational rehab counselor decides. It's a very person-centered process.
Sure.
I work at Edison, and we do have the CTE program, and yes, our students that have disabilities are having the process of trying to get certifications. Our teachers that are, do supply CTE for our kids, everybody has access to it, so we have 4 pathways for our kids. So we do supply that to our students with disabilities. So, you know, what you said about that, we do that in the city school district. It's not like we don't. And Access VR is huge in our school. We have a transition, person who does help our students go from school into the